Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Lockean Diaries. I'm Alex,
I'm Cass.
and today we've got a very special guest with us. Would you like to introduce yourself, Alistair?
Hello, I'm Alasdair. I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, and one of my main research interests is the philosophy of time travel. And I teach a course on it for my fourth year students.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. And before we sort of jump in with some of our questions in our little interview, we're going to play a quick game of what we like to call quick fire philosophy. It's
Yeah.
something that we do to introduce our new guests. So it goes like this: we're going to each take turns and ask you one question. And if you could just take 60 seconds to give the first answer that comes to your head, it just gives the audience a chance to know a little bit about you and your thought process before we get started. Is that okay?
Yep, sounds fine.
Yeah. Alex, do you mind if I go first?
Go ahead.
Right. So I don't know if you heard of like Apple Teleport, but I think it's this new project that Apple's working on to teleport people essentially, and it costs around like $29 million. Do you think it should cost that or not?
Gracious me. I'm out of the loop here. I didn't know Apple were planning to teleport people. No disrespect to Apple, but I've seen too many science fiction stories where teleportation goes horribly awry. I refer
Yeah.
you to George Langeland's The Fly and a series of films based thereon about a man who gets into a teleporter having failed to check it for concealed insects. And he gets out at the far end, kind of gene spliced with a fly and all manner of horrible complications ensue. I mean, good luck to them. My understanding was that it's difficult teleporting the quantum state of a single photon from one side of a laboratory to the other. And obviously, teleporting people is like orders of magnitude more hairy a job than that. So, I mean, goodness me, I'm a bit surprised by that. Clearly, I'm behind the curve on teleportation technology by some margin. As I say, not meaning to cast aspersions at Apple, but I would wait for the technology to get bedded in before I let somebody teleport me. Because as I said to one of my personal identity lectures a few weeks ago, there are some things in life where it's better to have a complete failure than, say, 80% success. And I think teleportation is one of those things. I mean, 80% success, most things in life are fine, but 80% of a success at teleportation is leaving 20% of you somewhere else, and that could be life changing. So
Yeah.
I'm amazed by this. I mean, great, but I would say start off with something inanimate, something that can't sue you, something that doesn't have angry relatives and friends before you embark on shifting people. Gosh.
Yeah.
I
No,
think
fair
that
enough.
was
That's
a
a great
great answer.
response.
I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't know that either about Apple, and I certainly will not be signing up for that because maybe they should start transporting something else. I'm afraid
Yeah.
I don't have a better question for you. I think it's going to be just as tricky to answer, but this is the nature of quickfire philosophy. So, Alistair, my question for you is: if time travel was possible and you had the ability to, would you choose to go back and kill baby Hitler?
um, I would be unable to resist trying to tinker with history. I mean, as I say to my students, we use killing just as a way of dramatizing it. You don't have to kill anybody. I mean, suppose I go back to Vienna in 1908 and I just buy up all Hitler's pictures. I rock up and I greet the starving artist Hitler who's standing there painting away, not actually very successfully. And I say to him, goodness, obviously I'm trained to pass myself as a native Viennese of the period. I've got the language and the whole bit, which I don't have in actuality. But I say to him, oh, goodness me, Herr Hitler, the use of colour, how many of these canvases have you got? I'll take the lot. And I just steer him into basically a broom cupboard and he lives out an innocuous existence as a mediocre landscape artist. The problem is that there's a bit of a, I mean, there's different ways of thinking about time travel. One of them is that you are that if you land in the history that you come from, there are certain things you're not going to be able to do. And sadly, the history I come from, Hitler has the career that he's recorded to have had with millions of deaths, and he dies in 1945. So there doesn't seem a lot I can do to change that if I land in the history whence I come. But I would probably try. I'd try something. But I strongly suspect that if history is consistent, I would fail, which would be very frustrating, no matter how many times I try. And people have used this as an argument that however physically plausible or not time travel might be, it hasn't happened because we would know, because lives like Hitler's would be strewn with the attempts of future time travelers to change them. And we don't see the long strings of coincidences that would accompany people queuing up to kill the infant Hitler or the young Hitler. Therefore, nobody travels back in time, is the argument. Another way of thinking about it, you don't land in the history that you come from, but you kind of create a different history, a kind of a branch history that kind of goes off and has its own conditions from the moment that you arrive. Now, in that model, yeah, I could kill the infant Hitler, I could keep the adult Hitler as a harmless watercolor artist. I could try to persuade Stalin or the man who goes on to be Stalin, to carry on studying in the Orthodox seminary where he was studying as a youth, and so on and so on. But the histories that I land in are not the histories whence I come. So in that model, the original Hitler and Stalin are left to pursue the careers that history actually records. With all that said, I think you would have a go, even if you were very confident you would fail.
Too tempting. But I think it's a really interesting point that you raised, this idea that time travel should almost be becoming evident to us in the sense that if people in the future are able to travel back in time, how come we haven't really encountered them yet?
Yeah.
And we aren't seeing the sort of the effect of this, because I think if Apple really does invent it and it becomes quite mainstream, that could just cause complete chaos. If everyone had access to it and it wasn't regulated and it was a mainstream thing.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing is that the idea that we cannot predict how these small actions might be able to change the future. There was a really popular meme going around recently about a person that said, when you get really bored of studying this guy, this painter in your art class, so you go back and make sure that he doesn't get into art school, and then you come back to the future and it's 100 times worse. And I thought that was a really sort of funny illustration of how we really can't predict how changing one small thing could change so many elements of people's lives. And I think that was a really good quick introduction to the topic. So without further ado, I think we'll get into it, shall we?
Yeah.
Okay, fine by me.
Okay, so I think sort of starting this conversation about time travel, one of the things we should first do is sort of define the term. So from your studies of the topic, what would you say, Alasdair, is your sort of definition that you give to the term?
Right. The best definition I know is due to an American philosopher called David Lewis, who wrote a paper called The Paradoxes of Time Travel in 1976. And Lewis's definition is the one I use with my students, and I think it's good for all the fictional scenarios and all the examples in physics that I've seen. And Lewis says time travel requires a difference between two ways of registering time. Time for the traveller and time in the external world, what Lewis calls personal time and external time. Now, non-time travellers, they don't have a difference between personal time and external time. Their measure of time is exactly as that going on in their surroundings. But a time traveller is someone for whom time registered for them and everything travelling with them. So, if you get into your time machine with a clock, it will register your personal time. So things like, your memory, your watch, your, accumulation of digestive products, cellular decay, wear and tear on your clothing, all register your personal time. But if you look outside the traveller's frame of reference, there will be some other way of measuring time, like Greenwich Mean Time, let's say. And a time traveller is somebody for whom personal time and external time have come out of sync. So one way to think about it, time time travel into the future would be you step into your wormhole, you activate your time machine or whatever, and 5 minutes passes in your frame of reference, and you get out and you find that 50 years have passed in the external world. So bingo, you're a time traveler. You have traveled successfully into the future. Backward time travel, similar idea. Again, personal time and external time are different, but the thing that's distinctive about time travel into the past is that your external time is negative. You arrive before you've set out. So you activate your time machine. In this case, you spend 5 minutes traveling. You feel 5 minutes older. Your watch registers 5 minutes has passed. There's 5 minutes wear and tear on the elbows of your jumper or whatever. And you get out of the machine and you find you've arrived 50 years in the past. So at that point, you've traveled backwards in time. So both of them, there's a difference between time for you and time in the outside world. And that, I think, is the way to define it, that there's a discrepancy between personal time and external time. And as I say, non-time travelers don't know any difference between personal time and external time. For those of us who don't travel in time, 5 minutes registered on your watch will be 5 minutes in the external world. But whether, in fact, this can happen in any major way is still hotly debated. But that is what it would take.
I think that's a really great point. I think it's almost important to make the distinction that normally when we're talking about travel, we're talking about some sort of destination.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of discrepancy when we're talking about time travel seems to be introduced by understanding some point in time as a destination within itself. So sort of making that distinction between time that's being experienced and time as a place we can almost go to is quite important. I was looking a lot into the sort of these philosophical ideas of things like eternalism and this sort of understanding of time as like a fourth dimension, where time would almost be like present, so in the past, present, and future, sort of eternally and simultaneously existing. Would you say that's something that you'd agree with?
I think,
as an idea?
yeah, I mean, I think eternalism, it's not the only way of thinking about time, obviously. It's not the only way of thinking about time to do with time travel, but it's definitely the easiest way of thinking about time. Because for the eternalist, as you say, time is like another dimension. Other times are like other places. They're just as real as where we happen to be now. They're not quite the same as other places because obviously, I mean, you are connected to other times by things like memory and causation. So the time dimension isn't quite the same as the space dimension, but the idea is that other times are like other places in the sense that they're just as real. I mean, for me, here is an upstairs room in my house on the south side of Edinburgh. Your here is somewhere else, but they're equally real, So for the eternalist, I mean, now for us is roughly 1814 on Friday the 8th of March 2024, but people in 1870 and 2070 are just as real as we are. They're just as concrete. So for the eternalist, as a way of thinking about time travel, eternalism at least means that there's always somewhere for you to travel to. Other times are just as real as, other places, which helps to explain how you can arrive somewhere and depart from somewhere. Because if you think that only the present moment exists, you might think, well, if the future doesn't exist, how can I travel there? Or how can anyone travel from somewhere that doesn't exist? So eternalism, as I say, isn't the only way to think about time for time travel, but it is probably the most convenient way. It's the one with the fewest problems. And it's a view that's got quite a lot of support from physics anyway. It isn't just, a philosopher's plaything to make room for time travel. It's something that's got quite a lot of support from particularly physics after Einstein. So eternalism treats time very much like another dimension of space. It treats objects as being extended in time rather than as they're extended in space. And so a time traveller is somebody whose journey through space and time, if they go into the past, has a kind of a funny shape. They go forward and then they go backward and then they go forward again. Whereas non-time travellers just kind of go forward. And so it provides quite a nice way of being able to visualize what a journey through time would be like as well. So I think there are definite upsides to having an eternalist picture of time. Yeah.
I guess you could also say that there's some downsides to sort of eternalist view in the idea that it's suggesting that it's almost in a way suggesting the existence of a fixed future. And I guess that can have some implications for things like freedom of its sort of ability and free will. And you could also say it has some implications on the idea of traveling back into the past and whether doing so would have any sort of effects on the future. So then you sort of go into the realms of possibilism and this idea that the future is maybe not fixed in the sense that it's reliant on our present and our past actions.
Yeah.
If that's something you want to talk about.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, eternalism definitely implies that future events exist, even if we never travel there. Even if we never, or at least we only travel there in the normal way. You know, we travel there 1 second per second and we get there in the ordinary course of events. But it does seem to have the perhaps worrying implication that that's actually a cat, incidentally. The thing at the moving thing at the left of the screen is a cat. I'm sorry. So yes, eternalism seems to have the slightly worrying implication that the future is real. You know, we don't know what 2025 is going to contain, but 2025 in some sense is out there. And people think, well, if the future is going to be a certain way, then what room do we have to be free? And there are various answers to this. One of them is just to accept that freedom isn't real, which is not a popular answer, I stress, philosophically. Sorry, Cass.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question. Do you think like freedom in that sense is like man-made and something that we conceive as an illusion, or?
I don't think it's an illusion. Defining it is a tricky one, and it's one that famously philosophers have been banging their heads on for well as long as we've got recorded Western philosophy, which is about 23 centuries. Because one of the things that seems to be crucial to freedom is the idea that you are in control. That, you know, you may be influenced by facts about your upbringing and your preferences and your heredity and your decision making and society and all the rest of it, but in some sense you make your decisions, or some of your decisions, happen the way they do. And that sense of optionality, say people with a certain view of free will, only makes sense if there's real openness in nature, you know, that you actually could do something different from what you do. And in some sense, if the future is there, then you can't do something different from what the future is going to do. You know, whatever the future is, if it's a certain way, you can't make it different from what it's going to be. Now, there are people who say, well, freedom can survive even if the future is real, because the future being real isn't the same thing as you being powerless. Maybe the future is a certain way because of your decisions. Maybe you help to make the future what it is. I mean, my own feeling is that I'm not so worried about the future being real as long as it stays where it is. Stays, you know, in the future. And I only get to it in the usual, you know, in the correct sequence. If bits of the future started cropping up in the present day, you know, if I started getting messages from my future self, which I hasten to add I have never had, but if I did start getting messages from my future self and I didn't immediately conclude that I'd gone mad, which I think would be my first, my first port of call. If I started getting what looked like reliable information from my future self, then that would be really quite a challenge for my conception of freedom. Because it seemed to imply that not only was my future out there, it was telling me what it was going to be. And that's why traveling into the past seems quite problematic in sort of freedom terms. Because back to the picture I sketched a moment ago, if you think that what you do in the past has got to be consistent with the history whence you come, then there are things you can't do. You know, you can't kill the infant Hitler. You can't prevent yourself making the unfortunate remark at a party that ruined an otherwise promising friendship. You can't change your revision strategy before an exam so that you pass the exam that you actually failed. And you think, well, what stops me? Well, I mean, I could go back and I could exert myself to the utmost, but something will. If the history you arrive in is consistent with the history in which you come, something is going to stop you from changing it. And that might look very, very strange. I mean, that might play out in all kinds of weird ways. So I think there does seem to be a real worry about the future being restrictive if it's real, but that worry gets worse if the future starts sending you information.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think it's a really hard thing that a lot of people struggle to get their head around is this idea that just because the future almost seems predestined, it doesn't necessarily mean that your actions in the present aren't the thing that is making the future the way that it is. So my actions now, this conversation that we're having is going to lead to the ultimate, let's say, me releasing this episode of the podcast. And the fact that that podcast episode exists in the future doesn't mean that my sort of our actions of sitting here and having this conversation now any less of our choice. It's almost, they're almost proportional and directly influencing each other all the time. I guess that goes back to this idea that it almost works in an eternalist sense, that past, present, future almost have to exist all together for them to be able to interact in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it could well be that, our future actions and our past actions are kind of mutually adjusting, and that neither of them is dictating to the other, but nonetheless they both contribute. I mean, I think decision making in a world where time travel was a fact would be very, very strange. I mean, there's a whole philosophical industry about this. Suppose you find out that your future self is going to do something and you really think it's your future self. You think, well, it's not a double, it's not an elaborate conspiracy, it's not a hallucination. That was my future self I saw doing X. And you think, well, if I'm convinced it's my future self, I have no sort of wiggle room. I have no power to do or not to do. But stranger yet, I don't seem to be able to deliberate over it. I mean, usually you can deliberate over something if you're not certain whether you're going to do it or not. I can deliberate about what I'm going to have for my dinner tonight, but I can't deliberate about what I've had for my lunch. If you suddenly start seeing your own future actions, they may be future in the sense that they're further down the line in your personal time, but they're not available for you to deliberate and to look at your own actions from outside like that. Actions that are future but not a mean to deliberation would be a very challenging experience. This is why people ask me what I would do if I had a time machine, and I'm tempted to say semi-flippantly, "Will not go anywhere when I'm going to find out what I do." Which means not only would I be careful about traveling into the future, but I would be careful about traveling into bits of the past where I'm likely to run into myself, as it were. Because if you knew what you were going to do, you don't seem to be in any position to do something different, and you don't seem to be able to deliberate over it. I mean, suppose you see yourself doing something, awful. Suppose you see yourself, assassinate somebody. It's difficult to say that you could be hauled in front of a judge and say, well, I saw myself doing it, so I had no choice. As far as I'm aware, time travel is not an admissible plea of diminished responsibility in any court in these islands. And yet, in a sense, your responsibility would be undermined. You're not doing something because you want to do it. You're doing it because you did it. And
that's a really confusing idea to get your head around.
Yeah, it's really interesting, sure.
Just a question I want to jump in with here is I think it might be a good time to introduce the idea of a higher power or a god to this sort of scenario. And I don't personally know what your views are on it. I know that Cass isn't someone who believes in the God themselves, but I'm Catholic, so I do believe in the existence of God. And just sort of hypothetically speaking, I guess, would you think the existence of such an omnipotent and omniscient being could have any implications for the existence of time travel?
Oh, goodness. Well, yes. I mean, that's a good question. I refer you to a lovely novel called The Psychology of Time Travel by Kate Mascarenhas, which is, I mean, it's not just a good read. It is a good read. It's a brilliantly constructed sort of crime thriller, really. But it's also got some real philosophical depth to it. And in there, it's entertained, it's not insisted on, that one way to make sense of time travel constraints, what stops you killing baby Hitler, is precisely that a time traveler's universe is a God-run universe in its details. I mean, it's set in a kind of alternative world where time travel was invented in the 1950s. I think it's the 50s. And its central characters grow up to middle age and old age, having interacted with different stages of themselves. And one thing that's seriously floated is that it meshes together because it's under external coordination. Now there's a very useful way of thinking about time, which maybe ties together this theistic perspective and some of the stuff that we were saying about information from the future. St. Augustine was much exercised by a problem not unlike the time travel and freedom problem, namely the problem that if God knows the future, then God knows what we're going to do, and how can we be free to do what God already knows we're going to do? And Augustine's answer was, well, look, it's a mistake to think that God's knowledge comes before our actions, as if, in a sense, God is going through time in the sequence that we are. Augustine said, well, look, time is among the things that God made. Time isn't something that binds God. I mean, time is real, but there are things that are real that aren't in time, and God is one of those things. And so God's perspective on time is kind of from outside looking down. And so it isn't that God knowing now what we're going to do tomorrow restricts what we're going to do. It's that our doing what we do shapes what God knows. So with that kind of understanding, you can think, well, maybe future events are what they are because of what we do now. It's not that the future pulls us towards it. So, I mean, there are some very interesting ways of kind of joining philosophy of religion and philosophy of time travel together. I mean, I've seen, for example, one big issue in philosophy of time travel is what happens if you run into another stage of yourself. Suppose you jump forward in time and there's yourself older, or you go back in time and you meet your younger self, and there's suddenly two of you at different places at the same time, which is a difficult trick for a human being to work. And I've actually seen this quite an extended debate about using time travel as a model to understand the persons of the Trinity. Not saying that the time travelers, I stress, but saying that the relationship between different stages of a time traveler, allowing simultaneous presence and yet distinct parts of the same person, might be a way to conceptualize how the Trinity could work. So there are ways of thinking about these things that draw on the philosophy of time and philosophy of religion. And, specifically people have argued, well, actually, the constraints under which a time traveler would have to work might look actually supernatural, as if they are directed from outside, and maybe they look supernatural because they would be supernatural. Now, what the best way to think of those constraints is, I don't know, but I think the constraints on a time traveler would look very strange, possibly, eerie even, repeated failures to try to make something happen that you should be able to do. As I say to my students, a gun that works perfectly if you point it at somebody else in the present day, if you take it back in time and point it at your earlier self, seems to be guaranteed to fail. You can't destroy your earlier self for the same reason that you can't destroy baby Hitler, but worse, because it's your earlier self. If your mission succeeded, you're not there to carry it out. And that could look very strange.
Yeah, you're right.
I think we could almost bring in the views of Saint Anselm when we're talking about Augustine. Augustine's one of my favourite philosophers. We do a whole topic in him on my A-level course at the moment. And one of the things we go into is sort of the problems of God as a being that can almost see and predict the future, and how that sort of has implications for our free will. And one of the things sort of that we learned about was like the four-dimensionalist approach. Is that something you know much about?
Yeah, I mean, four-dimensionalism is a theory of persistence, actually, often, and it takes this idea of time as another dimension and says, well, just as things can be extended over space, they can be extended over time, and your other selves, other moments that are literally parts of you. So just as my right hand is a spatial part of me, so my primary schooling, 1975 to 1980, is literally part of me. It's part of my four-dimensional extent. And there are some advantages to that. I mean, like it helps explain why an object can be the same and yet undergo a complete change in properties. I mean, many years ago, I was about 3 foot tall and fair-haired and didn't have a beard or glasses or a doctorate when I was about 4. And now, obviously, the passage of time, I've got, well, a kind of a badger effect hair going on, and I've got specs and a doctorate, and I'm a lot older and bigger and fatter. And how can an object be the same? And the answer is, well, it's just parts of you. This part, has the spectacles and the badger thing going on, and the 1974 part is fair-haired, but they're joined together across the time dimension. So there are some, interesting ways of doing that, and people have used this to explain how persons work, how persons are joined together.
Yeah, this is a very good point, and it kind of reminds me of Hume's causation of events. Like, I don't know, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, Hume continues to cast a long shadow in the philosophy of causation. He is unfortunately his view of causation, unfortunately, is very hostile to time travel.
Oh, wait, how come?
Well, if you think about it, Hume says that if one event is the cause of another, that just means that whenever you see an event of the first type, you see, and it's followed by an event of the second type. So let's say whenever you see a plate glass window being hit by a brick and the window shatters, you think the throwing of the brick is the cause of the window shattering. But you don't see what it is that ties the throwing to the shattering. You just see that one event is followed by the other.
Yeah.
And Hume said that you don't know this, but for all you could imagine that the brick hits the window and the brick turns to steam, or the brick hits the window and it just passes through the window without interacting with it at all. It's only experience that tells you which one goes with which other event. So with that view, the only difference between a cause and an effect is that the cause comes first. So by definition, the cause comes first. But one of the things that makes backward time travel conceivable is that there have to be circumstances where a cause is later than its effect. I mean, suppose somebody punches me in the face before I get in my time machine in 2025, and I get out in 1965 and I've got a black eye. Well, the punch in 2025 causes the black eye in 1965, but the punch is later in time than the black eye. And Hume would say, well, in that case, actually, the black eye is the cause of the punch.
Yeah,
So,
doesn't make sense.
yeah, and so if I mean, Hume's account of causation, which actually has more going for it than I think sometimes people are prepared to grant, but it does mean that there's no difference between a cause and an effect, except that the cause comes before the effect. And that seems to mean that there can never be cases where the effect comes before the cause. And if effects can't come before causes, it's very difficult to see how you could travel backwards in time.
Yeah, agreed. Hume does make it quite limiting. Yeah.
You could almost have to make the distinction that cause and effects have to sort of exist simultaneously, in the sense that that would make the sort of the example that you gave more possible. And I don't think that's something that Hume would have even thought to consider. I don't think time travel was probably something he even thought he'd
Yeah.
even have to
Yeah.
talk about in the
Yeah.
times that he was writing. So I think that's a really interesting to sort of evaluate it from
Yeah.
that modern perspective, if
Well,
that makes sense.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting when did people start thinking about travel in time? When did people start seriously worrying about would it be possible? I mean, there's a passage in the Talmud where Moses is brought forward in time to see a future rabbi, historically real rabbi actually, in the process of teaching the Torah based on Moses' teaching, so that he can see the consequences of his own teaching. And it's strongly implied that he is actually brought into a future time and then allowed to go back in time. And there's a passage, I think, in the Bhagavad Gita where one segment of Vishnu's life is hours and also centuries, according to where you're standing. So the idea of not just time passing at different rates, but people moving about in time is actually very, very ancient. But it's not something that philosophers began to get worried about until the early 20th century. Fiction was there slightly ahead of them. There are quite well thought out stories of time travel, certainly from about 1879, 1880 onward. But there seems to have been a bit of a gap in the 18th century. I'm not aware of any 18th century stories of time travel or anybody in the 18th century thinking about it.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, do you think like the theory of the Big Bang impacted like people to think more about time travel? Because I guess there's this question of like when did our world like really start, and that's something also like debated with like Aquinas' argument, like everything started with God, but like we still are quite confused about that.
Yeah, I mean, the Big Bang introduces a lot of interesting issues, and it actually crops up in the philosophy of time travel for a slightly non-obvious reason that I'll come to in a moment. I mean, as I understand classical Big Bang cosmology, the best illustration of it I know comes from Stephen Hawking, and he used to say that don't think of the Big Bang as an event in time. Don't think of it as an age. He said, asking what came before the Big Bang is like asking what's to the south of the South Pole.
Oh yeah.
Which is a very nice analogy, because all paths that head south converge on the South Pole. But if you imagine drawing a line through the South Pole, it just keeps going and it starts heading north. And that's apparently what classical Big Bang theory says the Big Bang is like. It is the point beyond which the time sequence can't be extended. Now, I used to give a talk to higher philosophy students, teachers, about the first cause argument, and at Aquinas, and I perhaps slightly flippantly said that Stephen Hawking needed to read some Augustine. And I was delighted to find that one of Hawking's later books actually references, and I'm not for a minute suggesting that it's due to me, but somebody put Hawking onto Augustine, because Augustine actually does say, saying that God is the first cause is not to be considered as saying God is the first thing in time. God can be first in the sense of kind of foundational. So even if there's no edge to time, that doesn't necessarily remove the need for an external kind of foundational cause. But the interesting thing about the Big Bang is that there's an event which cannot have an earlier cause, at least in classical Big Bang cosmology. And this crops up. I mentioned David Lewis a moment ago, but one of the problems that David Lewis was much occupied by, besides what stops you killing your infant grandfather to be and all that kind of, the other classic time problem is known as the causal loop, where an event becomes one of its own causes. And Lewis's example is, I'm going to embroider this a bit for kind of illustrative purposes, but you're sitting at home one night and the phone rings and an oddly familiar voice says, don't say a word, write these instructions down and follow them to the letter. And you do, and it turns out you've been given the instructions for building and operating a time machine. And the time machine takes you into the recent past. And on arrival, you dial your own phone number. An oddly familiar voice says, hello. And you say, don't say a word, write these instructions down and follow them to the letter. And you give your earlier self the instructions for operating the machine. And Lewis says, well, where do the instructions come from? And his answer is, surprisingly, they don't. They're just there. The older self knows how to build a time machine because the older self's told by the younger self. Oh, sorry, the older self remembers being the younger self, and the younger self knows how to build the machine because the younger self was told by the older self. Why does the whole chain happen? Well,
it's almost as if by that happening, it's becoming the source of its own existence, which creates a lot of sort of issues in itself.
Well, that's right.
It's kind of similar to the sort of, if you've heard of Polchinski's paradox, this idea that a billiard ball is sent through a wormhole, collides with its earlier self, and that ultimately prevents it from entering the wormhole in the first place.
Yeah.
And then you have this issue in almost the opposite sense of it becoming the reason that it never happens.
Yeah. Well, the reason why that's a nice one is that that's like a grandfather paradox, but just with a purely physical system. The billiard ball pings through the wormhole and arrives back in time, just in time to deflect its earlier self from going into the wormhole. So how does it contrive to go into the wormhole to stop its earlier self, and round it goes? And that basically is the classic grandfather paradox problem, but without worrying about freedom. I mean, the billiard ball presumably doesn't have any free agency. It's just going through the universe as a purely physical system. And so one way to deal with things like the Polchinski paradox, or indeed the grandfather paradox, is just to say, well, there are certain things that look possible outside a time travel context that stop being possible once time travel is introduced into the mix. Like the example I used a minute ago of the gun. The gun that you point at some external person in the present day might fire perfectly well. Take it back in time and point it at your earlier self, and it seems guaranteed to fail. And it might fail in a very strange way. It might fail, like it might just turn to jam in your hand, or it might melt, or it might fire at a bullet which just miraculously skips around your head and doesn't interact with it. So maybe the constraints that keep time consistent, that avert paradoxes like the Polchinski one, might look very strange. I might just jump back to the Big Bang for a moment. Because Lewis, back to this phone call case, Lewis says, well, where does the information come from? And Lewis says, well, where does information come from anyway? I mean, suppose that, there's only a certain number of ways that events can be joined together. I mean, suppose that every event has a cause, but it just goes back and back and back and back and back. A is caused by B, is caused by C, is caused by D. And every event has a cause. But in an infinite chain, you ask, well, where does the whole chain come from? And it's not that we have a good answer. But then suppose the Big Bang theory is true. A has a cause, B has a cause, C has a cause. Then you hit the Big Bang. And there's no cause for the Big Bang. And Lewis says, look, after Big Bang cosmology, after classical theism, there are plenty of theories that postulate that the Big Bang or God are real things that are causes, but don't themselves have causes. So the self-creating time machine is very strange. But like any other chain of events, each event has a cause, but we maybe can't explain the whole chain. Now, I don't know how satisfactory that may seem to you, but that's Lewis's answer. Self-causing objects are no harder to explain, ultimately, than any other kind of object.
You could almost go into this idea that one of the things that I always think about when it comes to sort of Aquinas and the first cause argument is this idea that he came up with the first cause argument to sort of explain away the problem of an infinite regressive chain that was constantly causing the next thing and the next thing. But the question that always comes to my head is, why can't there be an infinite chain of existence of continual cause and the next thing coming after the next thing? It might be an idea that we want to explain away and one that we might not be able to get our head around, but is there anything stopping the existence of sort of an infinite chain?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, philosophical opinion is, to put it mildly, heavily divided on this issue. There are people who think, well, maybe an infinite chain of causes, of causes, of causes, of causes is just something that we might have to live with.
Yeah.
The problem is it's difficult to see how it got started, but then it's difficult to see how the Big Bang got started. In a way, an event that has no cause is a bit like an event that's got an infinite chain of causes. In both cases, it's difficult to see where the whole thing came from. And so Lewis's account of causal loops, I think one way to think about it is to say, well, look, we've got lots of good stories for where individual events came from. You know, why did the chicken cross the road in order to get to the other side? Why did the explosion occur? Well, there was gas in the room and someone walked in the room holding a naked flame. So you can explain individual events quite easily. But when you start trying to explain a whole chain of events, you think, well, why did the chicken come to be there? For that matter, why are there chickens? Which came first, the egg or the chicken? You know, okay, life evolved. Where did amino acids come from? Why were the conditions right for the evolution of life? Why are there planets? Why are there laws of nature? And you set off on what seems like a promising, regressive explanations. And so one way to read what Lewis says about causal loops is causal loops just dramatize a problem that happens all over the place. That we've got very good stories for explaining individual events, but when you step back and try to explain a whole chain of events, whether it's an infinite chain or a finite chain, it's a much harder task. And so there are people who say, well, maybe we might just have to accept that an infinite chain of descent is no worse than any other. I mean, obviously, Aquinas didn't think that that was acceptable. And I think his retort would be, well, a chain like that can't get started. And if it can't get started, it can't have arrived here. Clearly we've arrived somewhere down a causal chain. Of all the possible causal chains, there's a causal chain which has led up to us. And so it must have begun in some sense.
I guess you could almost evaluate Aquinas in that sense with this idea that with Lewis's idea that things can almost cause themselves, and that could almost be a like a retort to it. But Cass, if you've got something to add.
Yeah, I was listening to your question, and I know that Alasdair did say like there could be like a finite end, but like my question would be like, what would that look like, and at what point in time would that occur?
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying to rationalize it myself, and like, would a finite end, like to us as humanity, like would it be like the Earth exploding?
Right.
Like,
well, yeah. I mean, the thing. I mean, we've had to kind of contend with the prospect of a finite end in the past. As I say, classical Big Bang cosmology says probably around about 13.9 billion years ago, extrapolating from how the universe has been expanded, 13.9 billion years ago, the whole thing was a single point of arbitrary density with space and time compressed around it, and then unfolded or exploded, depending on how you want to think about it, and generated everything around us. But there's no earlier event, and classic Big Bang cosmology says, well, you can't trace time back before the Big Bang, but there are alternatives. I mean, one alternative is to say that one universe's Big Bang was the end of the universe before it, so it's kind of cyclical.
Oh, yeah.
So you have like Big Bang, expansion, contraction, and then the opposite of a Big Bang, which is a big crunch, where things compress down to this point, and then the big crunch is somebody else's Big Bang, and on it goes, and on it goes, and on it goes. In which case, this universe is just one sort of fluctuation in a cycle that could stretch back and stretch forward through cycle after cycle after cycle after cycle. And something like that is there isn't much of a an ancient Western pedigree for thinking like that, but ancient Hindu astronomy and cosmology was actually quite friendly to the idea that the cosmos is cyclical and has been going through a succession of arrangement after arrangement after arrangement, as far as we can tell, infinitely. So one way to kind of defer the problem is just to say, well, our Big Bang is somebody else's Big Crunch. And our Big Crunch will be somebody else's Big Bang, somebody that we can't communicate with, somebody that we can't imagine, possibly. But that still kind of leaves the problem of, well, where does the whole thing come from? I mean, each
Yeah.
cycle is caused by the one before it, but you think, well, suppose I want to know where the whole system comes from. And that's where Lewis's problem comes back again. Each cycle is explained by the one before it, but the whole set of cycles is much harder to explain.
Yeah, great. I think there's, to sort of segue from the conversation we're having just now, there's one more sort of point on time travel that I think we should bring in here to sort of really cover the topic, and then we can move on in our last sort of 5 minutes to some general final discussion and,
Sure.
and a wrap up. But the idea of chaos theory and the butterfly effect.
Yes. Yeah.
Cass is excited about this, so if there's
Yeah.
anything you guys want to jump in on and talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that is, I mean, the classic change the past time travel story, Ray Bradbury's The Sound of Thunder, is precisely about somebody who treads on a butterfly. He goes on a Tyrannosaurus hunt. And this is a spoiler, but it's such a well-known story. I'm not, I hope, really spoiling. But chap goes on a Tyrannosaurus hunting safari to about 65 million years ago, inadvertently steps off the kind of platform for shooting dinosaurs, treads in the mud, stands on at the butterfly, and comes back to find that the cumulative effect from the absence of the butterfly has completely changed the course of history. And this is, I think, how people think about time travel. You know, you've got to be really careful not to cause a paradox. My own feeling is that the danger of causing paradoxes is kind of overrated, because you either land in the history whence you come, and anything you do in the past is already there, or you land in a different history. And there's no paradox, because you come from one world where you don't tread on the butterfly, and you land in another world where you do tread on a butterfly, and the two worlds kind of overcome. But then you don't, I mean, you could still have an effect on history, even if you didn't actually make history different from what it was. I mean, what I say to my students is, suppose I go back to Vienna to kill Hitler as a young man, and my time machine arrives on a Viennese street corner in a great flash of light. And on the other side of the street is the young Adolf Hitler. And Hitler is just about to step out into the road, and he sees the flash of light, and he steps back onto the pavement, out of the path of a tram that would otherwise have killed him. And I get out of the machine and I think, oh, great, I've saved his life. Not meaning to, you know. So even if you can't change history, there's still in the sense of making it different from what it was, there's still the possibility that you could impact on history. You know, in the sense, I think, blast, if I hadn't travelled back, Hitler would have died as a young man. So meaning to, I've made him possible. And you could find that you do have an impact on history, but not the one you want. And there's a lot of, you know, sort of stories of, you know, kind of ironic time travel where people go back in time to stop something happening and find that they're part of the reason why it did happen. So that, you know, you could find that you have a very big impact on the past, but not the one that you want, sadly.
That was a really good point to make there. Cass, is there anything else you sort of want to get in here question-wise before we go into a bit of a wrap-up?
Yeah, so one last question. I think we touched on this slightly earlier, but I know that when we talk about time, right, we talk about like the past, present, and future, and that seems like quite one-dimensional, like bah. Do you think what would higher dimension, like 4 dimension, look like with time? Because that's quite widely debated.
Yeah.
But we're not quite sure what the 4th dimension is.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to visualize what a 4-dimensional object would look like, and it's impossible to visualize what all your earlier selves stacked up would look like, because they would all be 3-dimensional. And they would be arranged in another dimension. So usually what we do is we cheat and we reduce time, we reduce space to 2 dimensions and just have time as the 3rd dimension. Just imagine cross sections through things. But at the risk of making a complicated story even more complicated, people have tried to make sense of time travel by imagining that time has more than 1 dimension. So that it's like a plane. So that, you can talk about ordinary time, and you can talk about ordinary times themselves being stacked up in a kind of hyper time. And so that way, you might be able to set out from your past and arrive in a distinct past and make it different. So I think it is hard to visualize. And my advice to people is, don't try to visualize things in 4 dimensions, because we're just not wired for it. I mean, with a bit of training, you can get a sense. I mean, I saw a wonderful exhibition, a series of 3D printed models of cross sections through a 4-dimensional analogue of a cube, a tesseract, as it's called, as it rotated. And I spent 5 minutes watching this strobing past, and I thought, yeah, I actually feel like I'm seeing a rotating 4-dimensional object. But don't ask me to describe it, and don't ask me to make the experience shareable. But at the time, it seemed like I was actually watching something. So usually what we do is we cheat. We just omit one of the spatial dimensions, and we say, right, this axis here counts as time, so here are all the cross sections. And as I said, you've got sort of speculations about time itself having multiple dimensions, or the universe kind of fissioning so that there are different copies at any given time. And there's lots of other, there's lots of alternative ways of thinking about the structure of space and time besides straightforward 4-dimensionalism. I mean, 4-dimensionalism comes to seem quite familiar and homely compared to some of these things. But it is useful to think of time as an extra dimension sometimes, to think of things as extended across time, just like they're extended across space.
Great. That was a really great question, Cass. I guess sort of getting to the end of our time here, and just to give a general wrap up, with one final question, and I think that the biggest question with everything we've talked about and all the sort of evaluation we've done, do you think that time travel is ever going to be a reality for us?
I think the physical obstacles are very, very, very considerable. The fact that we don't see people walking around from the future isn't necessarily a demonstration that it will ever happen. Because the way that physics thinks about time travel, a time journey is like a particular structure in space-time. It's a place, it's a region. It's a bit like getting on an escalator. And as I say to my students, there's no point getting on an escalator at Haymarket Station and expecting it to take you to Waverley Station. It will only join together places, And so it may well be that the right kind of structures will exist, but downstream of us. I think it's fairly likely that nobody has managed to create a structure that joins somewhere in our future to somewhere in our past. But conceivably, there could be ways of joining different points in time together, such that you go in at a later time and emerge at an earlier time. But I think such a thing doesn't connect with anywhere in our past. So I wouldn't want to say hand on heart that backward time travel is flat out impossible. There are too many physical mechanisms that seem to suggest such a thing could happen, but they're very difficult to realize. I mean, they're very, very tough things to build. They're not things that you build in your lab out of quartz and brass like H.G. Wells's Time Traveller. I mean, they're like moving around entire star systems and making them into cylinders and spinning them at incredible velocities, kind of thing. So they're extremely difficult to build. But I wouldn't want to rule out the possibility that something like that exists downstream of us. So it's possible that backward time travel will be possible, even if there will never be the resources that let someone travel back to where we are now. So that's hedging my bets, but that's the best I've got, I'm afraid.
That was a really great answer. So I think the only last thing we can say is good luck to Apple with their project.
Absolutely.
Yeah, also good.
Yeah,
good luck to CERN as well, because I know that currently they're testing out like not quite sure how to describe it, but testing out like different ways to use the particles to generate insane amount of speed. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I will await the outcome of the Apple teleportation with the keenest interest.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime. But
I would be surprised, but you know, who knows?
Anyway,
thank you.
Thank you so much for your time today. That was a really great episode. It was lovely having you on. That was really great. So,
thank you both. Thank you both very much. It's been lovely talking to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
We should be officially up on Spotify now, which is really exciting. So to anyone listening to this now, if you could take the time to just give us a rating, it really helps us, and we really appreciate it. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, folks.